On the evening of April the 14th, 1982, a 7-year-old boy in Leningrad overheard a conversation that would lead to his parents' execution. Dmitry Sokolov lay in his narrow bed, eyes closed, but mind alert, listening to the sounds of the communal apartment settling into its nightly rhythm. He was small for his age, dark-haired, with the kind of watchful eyes that suggested he noticed more than adults assumed. The room he occupied measured approximately 9 feet by 11 feet, barely large enough for his bed, a small desk, and a wooden chest containing his clothes and toys. This single room constituted his family's private space within the larger apartment at 47 Nevsky Prospect, shared with 3 other families in a building that had once housed a single, wealthy merchant's household before the revolution. The walls were thin. Dmitry had learned this truth gradually over his 7 years, the way children learn all uncomfortable facts about their world, through accumulated observation rather than explicit instruction. He could hear the Petrovs arguing 2 rooms away, their voices rising and falling like distant waves. He could hear old Konstantin Ivanovitch's radio through the eastern wall, always tuned to the same state broadcasting channel. And he could hear his parents in the adjacent room, separated from him by a partition that seemed substantial but transmitted sound with remarkable clarity. It was approximately 9:15 p.m. when his father came home. Dmitry recognized the particular pattern of footsteps in the corridor, the way Mikhail Sokolov walked with a slight hesitation, as though perpetually distracted by some complex calculation. The apartment door opened and closed. Low voices in the shared entryway, his mother's greeting barely audible. "You're late," Irina said. Not accusatory, simply factual. There was a delay at the plant, equipment malfunction in the testing facility. Dmitry heard his father's briefcase set down with its familiar soft thud against the floor. The smell of cabbage soup drifted through the apartment, mixing with the damp scent of spring rain that had been falling steadily since afternoon. Water tapped against the windows in irregular rhythm, a sound that made the boy think of fingers drumming impatiently on glass. His parents moved into their room. The door clicked shut, a sound that usually signaled adult conversation Dmitry wasn't meant to hear. He pulled his thin blanket up to his chin and listened. "Did anyone see you?" His mother's voice, lower now, carried an edge of something Dmitry couldn't quite name. Years later, he would recognize it as fear. "No, I was careful, the same route as before." Mikhail's words came slowly, as though each one required consideration before release. "When?" "Saturday, April 17th, the usual location." Dmitry's mind began constructing possibilities. Saturday was 3 days away. A location suggested travel, perhaps an outing. His birthday wasn't until September, but sometimes parents planned surprises for no particular reason. He remembered last year when they'd taken him to see the Bronze Horseman on a Sunday afternoon, just the 3 of them, without mentioning it beforehand. "Robert confirmed?" Irina asked. "Robert?" The name meant nothing to Dmitry. He didn't know any Roberts. It sounded foreign, American maybe, like names he'd heard in the films occasionally shown at school. Carefully selected productions demonstrating the moral superiority of Soviet life compared to Western decadence. "Yes, same protocol. The bench near the Admiralty Garden entrance, 3 o'clock. He'll leave the package in the usual place." Package. Dmitry's imagination filled with wrapped boxes, potential toys or books. The Admiralty Garden was a nice park. He liked the trees there, the way they created tunnels of shade in summer. The floorboards creaked as someone shifted position. His father, Dmitry guessed, likely sitting on the edge of the bed the way he did when removing his shoes after work. The boy heard the familiar sounds of this nightly ritual, leather loosening, the soft drop of one shoe, and then another onto the worn rug that covered a portion of their room's floor. "I'm worried about the frequency," his mother said. 3 meetings in 5 weeks. "I know, but the information is time-sensitive. Production schedules change. They need current data." Data. Dmitri knew this word from his father's work. Mikhail spoke occasionally about numbers and calculations, though never in detail. The boy understood his father did something important with airplanes, something involving mathematics too complicated for a 7-year-old to comprehend. "If anyone notices—" "They won't. I've been careful. Different routes, different times. Nothing appears irregular." A long pause, filled only by rain and the distant sound of someone running water in the communal kitchen. Dmitri felt sleep beginning to pull at the edges of his consciousness, the voices becoming softer, less distinct. "What about Dmitri?" Irina's question cut through the fog of his drowsiness. "He knows nothing. He's 7 years old. Children don't understand these things. If something happens—" "Nothing will happen. We've been doing this for 18 months. The system works. The Americans are professional." Americans. The word lodged in Dmitri's mind even as sleep began to claim him. Americans were the enemy, he'd learned in school. But that didn't make sense if his parents were meeting one. Perhaps Robert was a special kind of American, a friendly one. Or maybe Dmitri had misunderstood entirely, his child's mind assembling fragments into incorrect conclusions. The conversation continued, but the words lost their shape, becoming a low murmur that blended with the rain and the apartment's other sounds, water moving through old pipes, footsteps in the corridor above, the creak and settle of a building that had weathered too many Russian winters. Dmitri's breathing deepened, his small body relaxing into the narrow bed. He slept. The words he'd heard, Robert, Saturday, the Admiralty Garden, 3 o'clock, package Americans, these began their slow fade into the uncertain territory of half-remembered things, the way all childhood memories dissolve at the edges, losing precision even as their emotional residue remains. By morning, he would recall hearing his parents talk, but the specifics would blur. He would retain a vague sense of something secret, something important, but the details would scatter like rain on pavement, there and then gone, leaving only the faintest trace of dampness behind. What the boy didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that within 24 hours, those half-forgotten words would resurface. They would tumble from his mouth in an entirely different context, reaching ears that knew exactly what they meant. The machinery of his family's destruction had already begun its work. It was simply waiting for him to wake up. Mikhail Alexandrovich Sokolov was 41 years old in the spring of 1982. He had spent the previous 16 years working as an aeronautical engineer at the Leningrad machine building plant, a sprawling industrial complex on the city's southeastern edge that manufactured components for military aircraft. His education had been exemplary by Soviet standards. Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, graduating in 1963 with honors in mechanical engineering, followed by advanced certification in aerospace design in 1967. By all external measures, his career trajectory suggested success. He had risen to senior engineer status by age 32, supervising a team of 12 designers working on turbine specifications for next-generation fighter jets. His salary placed the family in the comfortable middle tier of Soviet professional life, not privileged by any means, but stable, secure. His wife, Irina Sergeyevna Sokolova, was 38. She taught Russian literature at secondary school number 47, a concrete block structure built in 1958 to accommodate the city's expanding population. Students knew her as demanding but fair, someone who actually read their essays rather than skimming for political orthodoxy before assigning grades. She had studied at Leningrad State University, completing her degree in 1966, a time when the brief cultural thaw under Khrushchev was already freezing over into the long winter of Brezhnev's rule. They had married in August 1973 at the Palace of Weddings on the English Embankment. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. 37 guests attended the modest reception that followed, held in the apartment of Irina's parents, who still lived in a building with private quarters, a relic of their status as early party members. Dmitri arrived 2 years later, born on September 3, 1975, at City Hospital No. 9. He weighed 3.2 kilograms. The family's allocation in the communal apartment on Nevsky Prospect came through Mikhail's workplace in 1976, replacing their previous accommodation in Irina's parents' building after the older couple relocated to a dacha outside the city. The single room measured approximately 100 square feet. They shared the apartment's kitchen, bathroom, and corridor with 3 other families, the Petrovs, Ivan and Ekaterina, both factory workers, plus their teenage daughter Svetlana, old Konstantin Ivanovich Morozov, a retired trolley driver, widowed, and the Karpovs, Dmitri and Olga, both accountants, childless. The bathroom schedule operated on a rotation posted beside the door, written in Ekaterina Petrova's careful handwriting. Monday through Friday, the Sokolovs had access from 6:30 to 7:15 a.m. and 8:30 to 9 p.m. Weekends followed a different arrangement. Violations of the schedule generated friction that could poison relations for weeks. Kitchen use required similar choreography, 4 families, 1 stove with 4 burners, limited counter space, a single sink. Irina typically prepared dinner between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m., her pots and pans occupying 2 burners while she navigated around whoever else was cooking. The small refrigerator held shelves marked with each family's name. Trust existed, but only to a point. Neighbor dynamics contained layers of complexity that Dmitri absorbed without fully understanding. The Petrovs were reliable informants. Everyone knew this, though no one spoke of it directly. Ivan Petrov served as building elder, a position that involved reporting irregularities to local authorities. Unusual visitors, suspicious activities, conversations that strayed too far from approved topics. These things reached official ears through predictable channels. Mikhail attended mandatory political meetings at the plant every Tuesday afternoon. These sessions involved readings from Pravda, discussions of production quotas framed in ideological terms, and occasional self-criticism exercises where engineers confessed minor lapses in socialist dedication. He participated with appropriate seriousness, neither enthusiastically nor reluctantly, maintaining the careful middle position that aroused no suspicion. Irina faced similar expectations at school number 47. Monthly pedagogical councils included substantial time devoted to ensuring literature instruction reinforced proper socialist values. Pushkin was acceptable, Dostoevsky required careful handling, and contemporary Soviet writers received disproportionate emphasis regardless of quality. She complied, teaching the approved curriculum while occasionally slipping unapproved poems into discussion, briefly, carefully, with students she trusted. Her small collection of samizdat poetry lived inside a hollowed-out copy of a Soviet encyclopedia, Volume 7, on the bookshelf in their room. The typed pages, passed hand to hand through underground networks, included works by Akhmatova and Mandelstam that couldn't be published officially. She read them late at night when Dmitri slept and Mikhail worked at his desk, memorizing verses she couldn't risk keeping long. The couple's discontent with the Brezhnev era remained largely unspoken, even between themselves. The period that historians would later call the era of stagnation was simply their daily reality, long lines for basic goods, aging infrastructure perpetually awaiting repair, a sense that the revolutionary promise had calcified into bureaucratic sclerosis. They were too young to remember the terror, too old to believe the system might reform itself. Mikhail carried the same worn leather briefcase he'd received upon graduation from Polytechnic, its corners scuffed, handle wrapped with electrical tape where the original stitching had failed. Inside he kept technical drawings, calculation notebooks, and a small photograph of Irina and Dmitri taken at a park 3 summers earlier. Dmitri's school uniform hung on a hook beside the door, brown wool jacket, white shirt, red pioneer neckerchief. The boy was enrolled in the Young Pioneers, as all Soviet children were, attending meetings where he learned songs about Lenin and played games emphasizing collective achievement over individual success. To external observers, the Sokolovs appeared entirely ordinary. Mikhail left for work at 7:30 each morning, returning typically around 6 o'clock p.m., unless plant obligations required later hours. Irina departed at 7:45, walking 12 minutes to school number 47, teaching 5 classes daily, coming home by 4:30 most days. Dmitri attended school from 8:30 to 2 Hong Kong, then either stayed for after-school programs or walked home to do homework under his mother's supervision. They ate dinner together when schedules permitted, simple meals of potatoes, cabbage, occasionally chicken or fish when available at reasonable prices. Evenings involved homework, reading, radio programs. Weekends included walks along the Neva, visits to museums, trips to Pioneer Palace for Dmitri's activities. The ordinariness was genuine and simultaneously performed. They were what they appeared to be: Soviet professionals, educated, competent, properly integrated into the system. And they were also something else, something that couldn't be displayed or discussed, quiet resistance that took the form of forbidden books and unexpressed thoughts, and in Mikhail's case, decisions that had begun 18 months earlier for reasons he never fully articulated even to himself. The apartment on Nevsky Prospect contained the accumulation of their married life, books approved and hidden, Dmitri's school projects, Mikhail's engineering texts, a small television that received 3 channels, dishes that didn't match, blankets that had belonged to Irina's grandmother, a clock that ran 5 minutes fast. They navigated impossible circumstances by making them appear possible, by performing normalcy until the performance became indistinguishable from reality. The thin walls transmitted sound, but also provided cover. Everyone heard everything, so everyone learned not to hear certain things, a collective agreement to maintain necessary fictions. This was their life in April 1982. This was the structure that would collapse within days, though nothing visible suggested its fragility. The first contact occurred on November 18, 1980, during an aerospace engineering symposium at Moscow State University. Mikhail had traveled from Leningrad with 3 colleagues presenting a paper on stress analysis in titanium alloy turbine blades. Technical work cleared for publication because it revealed nothing classified, though it demonstrated considerable expertise. A man approached him during the reception, following the second day's presentations. American, obviously, though his Russian was competent. He introduced himself as Robert Mitchell, representing a technical journal based in Washington. The conversation began with turbine design, moved to metallurgy, touched on testing protocols. Mitchell asked intelligent questions that suggested genuine understanding rather than superficial journalistic interest. "The pressures you mentioned, have you tested beyond the published thresholds?" Mitchell inquired, holding a glass of Georgian wine that he hadn't actually drunk from. "We have," Mikhail replied, "but those results aren't for publication." "Of course. Professional discretion." Mitchell smiled. "Though I imagine the data would be valuable to researchers facing similar challenges." The approach was neither crude nor obvious. No immediate recruitment pitch, no dramatic appeals to ideology or freedom. Simply a conversation between professionals, Mitchell's business card exchanged for Mikhail's contact information at the plant, a suggestion that they might correspond about non-sensitive technical matters. The second meeting happened 3 weeks later in Leningrad. Mitchell appeared at a cafe near the Admiralty, apparently in the city on business. Another conversation, longer this time, moving from technical specifics to broader questions about Soviet aerospace capabilities, production timelines, development priorities. At some point, Mikhail would later struggle to identify exactly when, the discussion crossed from permissible to dangerous. Mitchell made his proposition during a third encounter in January 1981. Declassified CIA files show the operation designated Aerostat, with Mikhail assigned the cryptonym Compass. The terms were straightforward: technical information in exchange for payment. No grand promises of defection or resettlement, simply an arrangement between parties with complementary interests. Mikhail's motivations were neither noble nor ideological. He felt no particular allegiance to American democracy, harbored no fantasy about escaping to the West. What he felt, according to later testimony during interrogation, was a grinding disillusionment with a system that demanded everything while providing mediocrity. His salary hadn't increased meaningfully in 6 years despite excellent performance reviews. The apartment on Nevsky Prospect represented the extent of his upward mobility. No private flat would ever materialize, no dacha, no meaningful improvement in circumstances. Financial pressure compounded frustration. Irina's parents required increasing support as they aged. Dmitry needed clothes, books, tutoring that wasn't available through state channels. The quiet erosion of purchasing power during the Brezhnev era meant that professional achievement translated to stagnation rather than advancement. He accepted Mitchell's offer in late January 1981. The dead-drop procedures followed standard intelligence tradecraft refined over decades of Cold War operations. Primary location, a bench in the summer garden, specifically the third bench from the north entrance along the central pathway. Mikhail would make a chalk mark on a specific lamppost on Nevsky Prospect, a simple horizontal line at eye level, to signal he had material ready. Mitchell's team would respond with their own mark, a vertical line intersecting the first, confirming the exchange was active. Timing operated on a precise schedule. Mikhail would visit the bench on designated dates, always between 2 and 3 p.m., carrying Pravda folded with the masthead visible. He would sit for exactly 8 minutes, leaving a small package, typically a 35mm film canister containing photographed documents, wedged beneath the bench's underside, where a metal support bracket created a concealed space approximately 2 inches deep. Recovery happened within hours, usually by a different operative following counter-surveillance protocols. Payment arrived through a separate dead drop in the Admiralty garden, concealed inside a false-bottom coffee tin left at a predetermined location near the garden's eastern wall. The amounts varied, typically 500 to 800 rubles per exchange, roughly equivalent to 2 months of Mikhail's salary. Information he provided included turbine blade specifications, stress test results, production schedules for the Leningrad plant's output, material composition data for heat-resistant alloys, and performance parameters for guidance systems being tested on prototype aircraft. Nothing approached the significance of nuclear secrets or strategic war plans, but the cumulative intelligence value was substantial. KGB case file 7829L, declassified in 1998, documented 18 successful exchanges between February 1981 and April 1982. Irina discovered his activities in August 1981. The specific catalyst remains unclear from available records, but interrogation transcripts suggest she found unexplained cash hidden in their room, 2,400 rubles, far beyond what they should possess. When confronted, Mikhail initially claimed a bonus from the plant, then gambling winnings before finally admitting the truth in a conversation that lasted past midnight. Her choice was impossible by design. Report him and condemn her husband to execution, destroy their family, leave Dmitri fatherless and stigmatized as the son of a traitor, or remain silent and become complicit, sharing the risk, accepting that every day might bring discovery. The decision she made appears in later KGB records. She chose silence, not enthusiastically, not without anguish, but definitively. She knew about the dead drops, the payments, the nature of the information being passed. She didn't participate actively, but her knowledge constituted legal complicity under Soviet law. Article 64 of the Criminal Code made no distinction between principal actors and knowing accessories in cases of treason. Their unspoken agreement centered on protecting Dmitri. The boy would know nothing. Conversations about the operation happened only when he slept or was absent. Money from the payments was spent carefully, in small amounts, on items that wouldn't attract attention: a better coat for winter, books for school, occasional treats that seemed within reach of their legitimate income. They maintained perfect compartmentalization between their clandestine activities and their visible family life. Mikhail continued attending political meetings at the plant with appropriate diligence. Irina still taught socialist literature to students at school number 47. Dmitri learned his pioneer songs and wore his red neckerchief with the oblivious pride of childhood. The operation continued through fall and winter, into the early spring of 1982. 18 exchanges, each successful, each increasing the documentary evidence that would eventually be used against them. Mitchell remained professional, punctual, consistent. The system functioned smoothly. What Mikhail and Irina couldn't know, what the most careful tradecraft couldn't prevent, was that their security depended ultimately on factors beyond their control. Not sophisticated surveillance technology or brilliant counterintelligence work, but something far more mundane and devastating. A 7-year-old boy's need to share what he'd heard, a teacher's sense of duty to the state. The ordinary machinery of Soviet life, where every citizen was potentially both victim and informant, where trust was a luxury that could cost everything. By mid-April 1982, they had been operating for 14 months without incident. The pattern had become routine, almost comfortable in its predictability. 3 days remained before it all collapsed. April 15, 1982, arrived with overcast skies and temperatures hovering around 8 degrees Celsius. Dmitri woke at 6:45 a.m., dressed in his school uniform, and ate breakfast in the communal kitchen while his mother prepared tea. He remembered his parents talking the previous night, remembered listening from his bed, but the specifics had already begun their fade into the vague territory of half-retained information. School number 47 stood 4 blocks from the apartment on Nevsky Prospect, a utilitarian concrete structure that housed 640 students across grades 1 through 10. Dmitri arrived at 8:20 a.m., joining classmates in the second grade section on the building's ground floor. Morning lessons proceeded normally: mathematics, Russian language, a reading period focused on a story about heroic young pioneers during the Great Patriotic War. The pioneer meeting began at 10:30 a.m. in the gymnasium, a large room with hardwood floors, faded red banners and a portrait of Lenin overlooking the space from the eastern wall. 37 children from grades 2 and 3 assembled in rows wearing their red neckerchiefs, standing at attention while Vera Petrovna Kuznetsova led them through the pioneer oath. Vera Petrovna was 53 years old. She had taught at school number 47 for 28 years, served as pioneer coordinator for the past 12, and held membership in the Communist Party since 1955. Her dedication to ideological correctness was well established among colleagues. She ran meetings with military precision, tolerated no disruption, and viewed her role as essential to shaping proper Soviet consciousness in the next generation. The meeting's agenda included announcements about an upcoming spring cleaning day, practice for a May Day performance, and an informal sharing session where students could discuss recent family activities. This last element served multiple purposes: encouraging public speaking skills, reinforcing collective values, and occasionally surfacing information about home life that might warrant attention from authorities. Dmitri raised his hand during the sharing session. "Yes, Dmitri Mikhailovich?" Vera Petrovna's voice carried across the gymnasium. "My papa is meeting someone on Saturday." Innocent words, childish enthusiasm about grown-up activities that seemed important because adults spoke about them in hushed tones. "That's nice. Where is your father going?" "To the Admiralty Garden at 3 o'clock to meet Robert." The boy spoke clearly, proud of remembering details. Around him, other children fidgeted, bored by information that held no interest for 7-year-olds. "Robert?" Vera Petrovna's tone remained neutral, but something shifted in her expression, a tightening around her eyes, barely perceptible. "Yes, an American, I think. They're getting a package." The words hung in the gymnasium's stale air. Dmitri noticed nothing unusual. He sat down, satisfied with his contribution, attention already drifting toward the prospect of lunch. Vera Petrovna's face had changed. The shift was subtle. She was too disciplined for obvious reaction, but her jaw tightened, her posture stiffened. She continued the meeting for another 12 minutes, guiding discussion through other students' mundane reports about weekend activities and family plans. Her voice remained steady, professional. Years later, in a 1995 interview conducted by a post-Soviet historical research project, she would describe the moment with uncomfortable precision. "I felt my stomach drop. American, a meeting, a package. These were not words that belonged in a child's casual conversation. I knew immediately something was very wrong." The meeting concluded at 11:15 a.m. Students filed back to classrooms for the next lesson period. Vera Petrovna walked directly to the administrative office, her mind racing through protocols learned during party training sessions about reporting suspicious activities. The internal conflict lasted approximately 18 minutes. She paced in the small office she shared with 2 other teachers, both currently in classrooms. Part of her wanted to dismiss the boy's words as childish confusion, misunderstood fragments assembled incorrectly. Children often garbled adult conversations, creating nonsense from overheard words they didn't comprehend. But another part, the part shaped by 27 years of party membership, by countless lessons about vigilance, by the understanding that enemy infiltration could happen anywhere, recognized patterns that couldn't be ignored. An American, a clandestine meeting, a package exchange. These elements assembled into something unmistakably concerning. She thought about Dmitri's father, Mikhail Sokolov. She'd met him twice during parent conferences. Quiet man, polite, clearly educated, an engineer at the machine-building plant. Nothing suspicious in his manner, but that meant nothing. Traitors didn't announce themselves through obvious behavior. At 10:47 a.m. she picked up the office telephone and dialed the local KGB administrative office, a number she'd been required to memorize upon assuming her position as pioneer coordinator. A man answered. She identified herself, stated that she needed to report potentially sensitive information overheard from a student. She was transferred to another line. She repeated her statement. A third transfer, this time to an officer who asked detailed questions, The child's name, the parents' names, their address, the exact words spoken, the context. "We'll handle this," the officer said. "You were correct to call. Document what you heard and keep the written record secure. Someone will contact the school by end of day." The call lasted 4 minutes. Dmitri, meanwhile, continued his day without the slightest awareness that anything unusual had occurred. Lunch was served at noon in the cafeteria, kashar with a small portion of boiled chicken, black bread, weak tea. He sat with his friend Pavel, discussing a science lesson about the solar system, arguing about whether Mars had water. Recess followed lunch, 30 minutes in the schoolyard where children played under supervision. The day remained overcast, but rain held off. Dmitri joined a group playing a game that involved chasing and tagging, running until his breath came hard and his cheeks flushed red with exertion. At the KGB office on Litany Prospect, approximately 3 kilometers from school number 47, mechanisms were already engaging. The report from Vera Petrovna triggered a check against existing files. Mikhail Sokolov's name appeared in routine employee screening records from the machine-building plant. Nothing flagged previously, but the plant's strategic importance meant all personnel maintained files that could be accessed rapidly. The words American and package and Admiralty Garden suggested espionage contact protocols. Standard procedure required immediate investigation. An agent was assigned to the case within 40 minutes of Vera Petrovna's call. Surveillance authorization was processed. Technical resources were allocated. By 1:30 p.m., a team was being assembled to observe the Sokolov apartment. Background checks were being expanded. The machine-building plant's security officer was being contacted for personnel records. Dmitri returned to class for afternoon lessons, his mind empty of concern. Geography, then penmanship practice, then a final period devoted to memorizing a poem about Lenin's kindness toward children. He recited his lines adequately when called upon, earning a nod of approval from his instructor. The school day ended at 3:00 Dmitri walked home through streets that appeared unchanged, past shops and tram stops and buildings he'd seen countless times. He climbed the stairs to the communal apartment, found his mother preparing vegetables in the kitchen, and settled at the small desk in their room to begin homework. The machinery of state security, once activated, operated with systematic thoroughness. Files were being reviewed, surveillance positions were being established, phone taps were being arranged, questions were being formulated. Dmitri worked on mathematics problems, tongue between his teeth in concentration, completely unaware that he had set in motion forces that would destroy everything he knew. His innocence was absolute. His impact was devastating. The system didn't require malice to function. It simply required citizens doing their duty, children speaking without understanding, teachers reporting what seemed wrong. By evening, Mikhail's arrest was already being planned. Mikhail Alexandrovich Sokolov was taken into custody at 6:30 p.m. on April 15, 1982, as he walked from the main engineering building toward the employee parking area at the Leningrad machine-building plant. 4 KGB officers approached from 2 directions, cutting off potential escape routes with practiced efficiency. 2 black Volga sedans blocked the pathway between buildings. The operation lasted less than 90 seconds from initial approach to secured detention. Witnesses employed at the plant later testified that Mikhail didn't resist. He simply stopped walking when the lead officer identified himself, standing motionless as handcuffs were applied. His face, according to a colleague who observed from a second-floor window, showed no surprise, only a kind of resignation, as though he'd been expecting this moment, and now felt almost relieved that the waiting had ended. The vehicles departed the plant grounds at 6:34 p.m., heading north toward Litany Prospect and the KGB's regional headquarters. At the communal apartment on Nevsky Prospect, Irina was preparing dinner in the shared kitchen when the knock came at 7:15 p.m. She had just begun slicing cabbage for soup, the knife pausing mid-stroke when she heard the commanding rap against the apartment's main entrance, not the tentative knock of neighbors or delivery personnel. Something harder, more authoritative. Ivan Petrov opened the door. 3 officers stood in the corridor, identification already displayed. Their request was neither a question nor negotiable. They needed immediate access to the Sokolov quarters for a state security investigation. The search began within 2 minutes. 6 officers eventually participated, the initial 3 joined by additional personnel who arrived carrying equipment for document photography and evidence collection. They worked methodically through the single room that contained the family's entire private existence, removing items and cataloguing them with bureaucratic precision. Mikhail's worn leather briefcase was opened, its contents spread across the narrow bed. Technical drawings, calculation notebooks, and letters were examined page by page. Irina's small bookshelf received particular attention. Officers pulled volumes down one at a time, shaking them to dislodge anything concealed between pages. The hollowed-out encyclopedia, Volume 7, containing her forbidden poetry, was discovered within 12 minutes of the search commencing. Neighbors gathered in doorways, watching with the practiced discretion of people who understood both the necessity of observing and the danger of being too obviously interested. Ekaterina Petrova stood at the kitchen entrance, pretending to wash dishes while tracking every movement. Old Konstantin Ivanovich Morozov positioned himself in the corridor, ostensibly checking his mailbox but remaining motionless for 20 minutes. Irina stood against the wall in the kitchen, hands clasped in front of her, face drained of color. A neighbor, Olga Karpova, interviewed by investigators 3 days later, described her expression. Like all the blood had drained away, her lips were white. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the men going through her things. Furniture scraped against the floor as officers moved the bed away from the wall, checking behind it for concealed materials. The desk was emptied drawer by drawer, contents sorted into piles. Dmitri's small chest of toys was upturned, wooden soldiers and schoolbooks tumbling onto the floor in a cascade of disorder. One officer's boot caught a tin soldier, crushing it flat against the floorboards. Items were confiscated systematically. 3 notebooks containing Mikhail's technical calculations, a file folder of correspondence related to his work at the plant, photographs of family outings that might contain coded information, Irina's collection of samizdat poetry, several books marked as potentially subversive, and personal letters exchanged between the couple during their courtship. Each item was logged in a hand-written inventory, signatures collected to document chain of custody. The search consumed 90 minutes. Paper rustled, boots thudded, drawers slid open and closed. The sounds carried through thin walls into adjacent rooms where neighbors listened and absorbed and filed away information that might prove useful later. Dmitri arrived home at 8:52 p.m., returning from the after-school program where he'd spent the late afternoon. He climbed the stairs carrying his school bag, mind occupied with thoughts about a project due the following week. He opened the apartment door and stopped. The corridor was crowded with uniformed men. His mother stood motionless in the kitchen doorway. The door to their room stood open, revealing chaos. Furniture displaced, belongings scattered, everything wrong. "Mama?" His voice was small, uncertain. Irina looked at him. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged immediately. One of the officers turned, assessed the boy with professional detachment, then returned to his documentation. "Dmitri, go to the Karpov's room." Her voice sounded strange, flattened of emotion. "Stay there until I come get you." "What's happening? Where's Papa?" "Just go, now." Olga Karpova appeared and guided him away, her hand on his shoulder, steering him toward her family's quarters at the apartment's opposite end. He glanced back once, seeing his mother's pale face, the uniforms, the disorder, visible through the open doorway. The search concluded at 8:47 p.m. Officers departed with 3 boxes of confiscated materials, leaving behind an official receipt and instructions that Irina remain available for questioning. The apartment fell quiet except for the sound of her beginning to restore order, picking up scattered belongings with mechanical movements that suggested shock rather than conscious purpose. Dmitri sat in the Karpov's room, perched on the edge of a chair, asking questions that received evasive answers. "Where's Papa? Why were those men here? Did we do something wrong?" Olga Karpova offered reassurances that convinced neither of them. "Your parents are helping with an investigation. Official business, nothing to worry about." At 10:22 p.m., the knock came again. 2 officers this time, their purpose stated simply. Irina Sergeyevna Sokolova was required to accompany them for questioning. She was permitted to gather a few personal items, toothbrush, change of clothes, identification documents. The process took 7 minutes. Dmitri was brought out to see her before she left. She knelt to his eye level, hands on his shoulders, face composed with visible effort. "Be good. Stay with the Karpovs. I'll be back soon." "When?" "I don't know. Soon." "Did I do something wrong?" The question emerged quietly, carrying weight beyond its simple words. "No, my love, you did nothing wrong." She pulled him close, holding him for 15 seconds while officers waited. Then she released him, stood, and walked toward the door without looking back. The apartment door closed. Footsteps receded down the stairs. The building settled into night rhythms, water running through pipes, distant voices, the creak of old construction adjusting to temperature changes. Dmitri remained with the Karpovs, installed in a makeshift sleeping arrangement on their floor. He lay awake for hours, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, listening to unfamiliar sounds. His toy soldiers remained scattered on the floor of his family's room, crushed and displaced, small casualties of forces he couldn't comprehend. Both parents were now in custody at KGB headquarters on Litany Prospect, beginning interrogations that would continue intermittently for the next 18 days. The boy didn't sleep until well past midnight. When he finally did, he dreamed of his mother's face, bloodless, shocked, irrevocably changed. He would see her again exactly twice before she died. The KGB headquarters on Litany Prospect occupied a sprawling complex of buildings constructed in stages between 1912 and 1975, their architectural styles spanning imperial grandeur and Soviet functionalism. The detention facility operated in the complex's eastern wing, a structure designed specifically for housing suspects during investigation periods that could extend weeks or months before formal charges were filed. Mikhail was assigned to cell 47 on the building's 3rd floor. The space measured approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a metal bed frame with thin mattress, a small table bolted to the wall, a wooden chair, and a toilet in the corner with no privacy partition. A single window, positioned 7 feet above the floor and barred with steel, admitted grey light, but prevented any view of the outside world. The walls were painted institutional green, the paint chipped and discolored by decades of use. Irina occupied cell 63, located 2 floors above on the 5th level. Her quarters were nearly identical in dimensions and furnishings, though her window faced north rather than east, admitting even less natural light. Interrogations began April the 16th, less than 12 hours after their arrests. The techniques employed were psychological rather than physical. No beatings, no direct violence, nothing that would leave marks requiring medical documentation. Soviet interrogation methodology in political cases had evolved beyond crude brutality into more sophisticated approaches that broke resistance through exhaustion, isolation, and carefully calibrated pressure. Sleep deprivation was implemented systematically. Mikhail was woken every 90 minutes throughout the first 3 nights, guards entering his cell on schedule to demand he sit upright, answer questions, or simply remain awake until the next cycle began. By the 4th day, his interrogation records note subject showing signs of severe fatigue, responses becoming less coherent. Meals arrived at irregular intervals, disrupting any sense of routine. Interrogation sessions were scheduled unpredictably, sometimes at 3:00 a.m., sometimes mid-afternoon, occasionally lasting 8 hours with minimal breaks. The isolation was absolute. No contact with other prisoners, no communication with family, no access to legal representation during the initial investigative period. Mikhail maintained denial for the first 2 days. Interrogation transcripts declassified in 1997 show his initial responses, claims of not knowing anyone named Robert Mitchell, insistence that his work involved only non-classified materials, assertions that some misunderstanding must have occurred. His interrogators, senior investigator Anatoly Grigorovich Suslov and his assistant, Captain Boris Leonidovich Petrov, pursued a methodical strategy of presenting evidence piece by piece. On the 3rd day, they showed him photographs taken during surveillance of the summer garden. The images captured him approaching. The designated bench, sitting for exactly 8 minutes, his hand reaching beneath the seat. The timestamp was visible. March the 2nd, 1982, 2:34 p.m. He stopped speaking for 47 seconds, according to notes in the interrogation log. "I can explain," he said finally. The confession emerged gradually over 6 days, not in a single dramatic admission, but through accumulated acknowledgements of specific facts that together assembled into a complete picture of 18 months of espionage activity. Yes, he had met Mitchell. Yes, he had provided technical documents. Yes, he had accepted payment. Each admission was documented, signed, incorporated into the expanding case file. Physical evidence recovered from the apartment supported every element of the confession. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their room, discovered during a more thorough search conducted April 17th, investigators found a 35mm film canister containing undeveloped microfilm, a small notebook with coded meeting schedules, and 1,847 rubles in cash. The money alone represented 8 months of Mikhail's legitimate salary. Additional intelligence came from an unexpected source, an American intelligence officer who had defected to the Soviet Union in January 1982. Debriefing records from this individual, whose identity remains classified in partially redacted documents, included references to aerostat operation and confirmation of a Soviet source designated Compass working in Leningrad's aviation sector. The defector's information had triggered initial KGB interest in the machine-building plant, making Dmitri's innocent revelation the confirmation of suspicions already developing. Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code defined treason as espionage, transmitting or gathering with the purpose of transmitting state secrets to foreign states or organizations. The penalty was specified unambiguously: death by shooting, with confiscation of property. Irina's interrogations followed a parallel track. Her interrogators, Senior Lieutenant Yevgeny Maximovich Orlov and Captain Nina Vladimirovna Sokolova, focused on establishing when she became aware of her husband's activities and what actions she took afterward. Sleep deprivation was used more sparingly with female prisoners, but isolation remained total and interrogation sessions lasted hours. She admitted knowledge within 3 days. Records from April 19th show her statement. "I discovered the money in August 1981. Mikhail told me where it came from. I knew what he was doing was illegal. I didn't report it. I made that choice." Her complicity was legal, not operational. She hadn't participated in dead drops or meetings, hadn't photographed documents or passed information. But she had known. Under Soviet law, that knowledge without reporting constituted a crime nearly equivalent to the primary offense. The question of Dmitri's role consumed substantial investigative attention. Was the child trained to deliver messages? Had he been used as cover during meetings? The answers emerged clearly after multiple interview sessions. No, he was 7 years old. He understood nothing. His revelation at school was purely accidental, the innocent repetition of overheard words whose significance he couldn't possibly grasp. Dmitri was questioned 3 times during the investigation period. The sessions were conducted at school number 47 rather than KGB headquarters, an accommodation made for cases involving minor witnesses. Vera Petrovna sat present during each interview, as required by regulations governing child testimony. "Why did you tell your teacher about Saturday?" the investigator asked during the first session, April 17th. "I don't know. I heard Mama and Papa talking. It seemed interesting." "Did they tell you to keep it secret?" "No, I don't think so. Maybe. I don't remember." "What did you think the meeting was about?" "I thought maybe a surprise or a trip somewhere. I thought Robert might be someone nice." His confusion was genuine, documented in the investigator's notes. Subject shows no awareness of significance of information. Responses consistent with innocent misunderstanding. No indication of training or intentional participation. The decision was formalized April 24th. Dmitri would not face charges. His testimony would be used in the case against his parents, but his role was classified as unintentional. He was 7 years old. The state, despite its severity toward traitors, maintained distinctions. By May 3rd, both interrogations had concluded. Mikhail had provided comprehensive confession, covering all 18 exchanges with American intelligence. He had identified Robert Mitchell from photographs, confirmed dates and locations, explained the technical nature of information transmitted. His cooperation was complete. Irina had acknowledged her knowledge and silence. She hadn't attempted to minimize her culpability, hadn't claimed ignorance or coercion. She had simply stated facts. The investigation file, designated Case 7829L, totaled 247 pages when completed. It contained confessions, physical evidence, surveillance photographs, witness statements, technical assessments of the classified information compromised, and recommendations for prosecution. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, legally sufficient for conviction under Article 64. Both suspects remained in detention awaiting trial. Cell 47 and Cell 63 were separated by 2 floors and 60 feet of concrete. They would not see each other again until they stood before the military tribunal. Dmitri remained with the Karpov family in the communal apartment, attending school irregularly, asking questions that received increasingly evasive answers. "When are Mama and Papa coming home?" "Soon, dear. Soon." But weeks passed. Soon never arrived. The Leningrad Military District Court convened on June 14, 1982, in a chamber located within the military headquarters compound on Suvorov Prospect. The proceedings were classified under Article 64 protocols, meaning they operated under conditions of absolute secrecy. No journalists were present, no outside observers, no representatives from foreign embassies. The courtroom itself was a modest space with fluorescent lighting, wood-paneled walls, and seating for approximately 30 people. 3 judges presided, all military officers with specialized training in cases involving state security. Colonel Pyotr Ivanovich Volkov served as presiding judge, flanked by Major Alexei Dmitrievich Kuznetsov and Major Yuri Nikolaevich Orlov. The prosecution was handled by 2 military prosecutors from the Leningrad Regional Office, Senior Counselor Vladimir Stepanovich Makarov and his deputy, Captain Anatoly Pavlovich Sorokin. Defense counsel was appointed rather than chosen. Mikhail was represented by Captain Ivan Sergeyevich Popov, a military lawyer with minimal experience in espionage cases. Irina's counsel was Lieutenant Nikolai Grigorievich Volkov, even younger and less experienced. Neither attorney had been permitted to review the complete case file until 3 days before trial commenced. Their role was largely procedural, ensuring the forms of justice were observed while the substance had been predetermined through the investigation's comprehensive documentation of guilt. The trial lasted 4 days. Court convened each morning at 9 to 12 a.m. and continued until approximately 6:00 p.m., with breaks for lunch and periodic recesses when judges reviewed evidence in chambers. Day 1 focused on evidence presentation. Prosecutors introduced 127 separate exhibits: surveillance photographs, copies of technical documents that had been photographed and passed to American contacts, financial records showing unexplained cash deposits, the microfilm and coded notebook recovered from the apartment, and transcripts of both defendants' confessions. Each item was entered into the record with meticulous attention to procedural requirements. The photographs were particularly damning. Images captured Mikhail at the Summer Garden bench on 6 separate occasions, his posture and timing consistent across months of surveillance. One photograph taken March 2nd with a telephoto lens showed his hand clearly positioned beneath the bench seat where the dead drop concealed materials for collection. Recorded conversations presented on Day 2 revealed operational discussions. KGB technical surveillance had begun April 16th, but had also, it emerged during testimony, been conducting sporadic monitoring of plant personnel for unrelated security reviews. Audio from February captured Mikhail and Irina discussing the timing of an upcoming exchange, their voices tense with awareness of risk. "If they're watching the usual location, use the alternate," Irina said on the recording. "I know the protocols," Mikhail replied. The tape was played twice. Both defendants sat motionless during playback, faces expressionless. Witness testimony consumed much of Day 3. Vera Petrovna Kuznetsova was called to recount Dmitri's statement during the Pioneer meeting. She testified clearly, professionally, showing neither satisfaction nor regret. When asked whether she had any doubt about what the child had said, she answered definitively. "No doubt whatsoever. The words were specific. American, package, Admiralty Garden, Saturday at 3 o'clock. Surveillance officers detailed their observations. Plant security personnel confirmed Mikhail's access to classified materials. Document experts testified about the technical specifications found on the recovered microfilm, establishing both their authenticity and their classified status under military security regulations. Dmitri's testimony was read into the record rather than presented in person. The decision to exclude the 7-year-old from courtroom proceedings was made by mutual agreement. Prosecutors didn't want the complication of a child witness. Defense counsel didn't want to expose him to the trauma. Judges saw no legal requirement for his physical presence when written testimony sufficed. "I heard Mama and Papa talking at night," the statement read. "Papa said he was meeting Robert on Saturday. I thought maybe they were planning something fun. I told my teacher because I thought it was interesting." The simplicity of his words contrasted sharply with the complex machinery of state prosecution that surrounded them. Mikhail testified on day 4. His statement lasted 37 minutes. He admitted everything. The initial contact with Mitchell, the 18 months of information transfer, the acceptance of payment, the betrayal of state secrets. His voice remained steady, factual, reading from prepared remarks that his attorney had helped refine. He attempted, near the conclusion, to minimize Irina's involvement. "My wife knew only because I told her. She didn't participate. She didn't want any part of this. The responsibility is mine alone." The prosecution objected. Irina's own confession was entered as rebuttal, her words clear about knowledge and silence. Irina spoke for 11 minutes. She didn't contest facts. She acknowledged knowing about the espionage, confirmed her silence constituted complicity, and made only one request. "My son is 7 years old. He understood nothing. Whatever happens to me, please ensure he's cared for appropriately. He's innocent." The judges deliberated for 90 minutes. The verdict was delivered June 17th at 4:30 p.m., guilty on all charges. Both defendants convicted under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, treason through espionage and transmission of state secrets to a foreign power. Sentencing followed immediately. Death by firing squad, property confiscation, case expenses to be paid from the condemned's remaining assets. The sentences were mandatory rather than discretionary. Article 64 violations involving military technical information transmitted to foreign intelligence services carried only one penalty under Soviet law. Mikhail stood motionless when sentence was pronounced. Irina closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and stared straight ahead. The appeals process was perfunctory. Both defendants submitted required petitions to the Supreme Court of the RSFSR within the mandated 72-hour window. The petitions were reviewed and rejected June the 27th, 10 days after sentencing. The rejection notices cited the comprehensive nature of evidence, the seriousness of the crimes, and the absence of any legal or procedural errors warranting intervention. Mikhail wrote a letter to Dmitry on June the 20th, composed in his cell using paper and pencil provided under regulations governing condemned prisoners. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in careful script. It explained that he loved his son, that he was sorry for choices that had led to this outcome, that Dmitry should remember both parents as people who tried their best in impossible circumstances. Prison authorities confiscated the letter. It was placed in case file 7829L as evidence, but never forwarded to its intended recipient. Regulations prohibited correspondence between condemned traitors and family members who might be influenced toward anti-state sentiment. A final family meeting was authorized July 2, 1982. Dmitry was brought to the detention facility by his maternal aunt, Galina Volkova, who had traveled from Petrozavodsk to assume guardianship. The meeting occurred in a small supervised room, 2 guards present, duration limited to 15 minutes. Mikhail and Irina sat on one side of a metal table. Dmitry sat opposite, small and confused, not understanding why his parents looked so thin, why his mother's hands shook, why his father couldn't meet his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. "Be good," Irina said. "Study hard. Remember we love you." "When are you coming home?" Dmitry asked. Neither parent answered. The silence stretched until one of the guards indicated time had expired. They were led away separately. Dmitry watched them go, still waiting for an answer that would never come. 26 days remained before the sentences were carried out. Dmitry Mikhailovich Sokolov was 35 years old in 2010, living in St. Petersburg in a one-room apartment near the Fontanka River. The city had reclaimed its pre-revolutionary name. in 1991 shedding Leningrad along with other Soviet-era designations, but the physical spaces remained largely unchanged. The same streets, the same buildings, the same prison cemetery where his parents lay in unmarked graves. His life had followed a trajectory shaped by absence and guilt. He had never married, never maintained a romantic relationship lasting more than 8 months. Friends were few, relationships carefully calibrated to prevent the intimacy that required revealing his family history. He worked as a freelance translator, converting technical documents from English to Russian, a profession that allowed minimal social contact and could be conducted alone in his apartment. He had no children. The decision was conscious, articulated clearly during a conversation with a psychiatrist in 2004. I can't risk creating someone who might inherit this burden. What do I tell a child about their grandparents? Post-Soviet Russia had engaged in incomplete reckoning with its totalitarian past. Some archives opened, some perpetrators were identified, some victims received acknowledgement. But the process remained fragmentary, inconsistent, subject to political pressures that oscillated between confronting history and rehabilitating Soviet nostalgia. Memorial societies documented cases of repression, erected monuments to victims, published names of the executed. Yet parallel to this accounting existed a countercurrent that celebrated Soviet strength, minimized state crimes, and resisted full moral clarity about what had been done and why. Dmitry had spent years thinking about responsibility, trying to distribute blame among the various actors whose decisions had converged to destroy his family. The exercise provided no comfort, only increasing complexity. There was himself. 7 years old, repeating words he'd overheard, creating the breach through which everything collapsed. Intellectually, he understood a child couldn't be held accountable for consequences he couldn't possibly foresee. Emotionally, the understanding changed nothing. He had spoken, they had died. The causal chain was undeniable. Vera Petrovna Kuznetsova had died in 2003 at age 74. Dmitry learned of her death months afterward through a former colleague he'd tracked down during his attempts to understand the full scope of what had happened. Among her effects, discovered by a niece settling the estate, were letters written in the late 1990s. Never sent, simply composed as a form of private reckoning. One letter, dated October 1997, addressed to no one specific. I reported what the boy said because I believed it was my duty. I was trained to watch for signs of disloyalty, to protect the state from enemies. I never questioned whether a 7-year-old's words warranted destroying his family. I followed the rules. I did what I was supposed to do, and now I lie awake at night thinking about 2 people who were executed because I made a phone call. Her guilt had remained unresolved until death. Perhaps there was no resolution available. She had acted according to the system's logic, fulfilling responsibilities that seemed clear at the time. The system's collapse revealed those responsibilities as participation in horror, but moral clarity arrived too late to undo consequences. The KGB officers involved had followed various paths. Senior investigator Anatoly Grigorovich Suslov, who led Mikhail's interrogation, retired in 1989 with full pension and honors for distinguished service. He died in 2001, his obituary making no mention of specific cases he'd handled. Captain Boris Leonidovich Petrov, his assistant, transitioned to private security work after the Soviet collapse, eventually moving to Israel in 1990. The judges who presided over the trial had scattered into post-Soviet obscurity, some continuing legal careers under the new system, others disappearing from public record. None faced prosecution for their roles. The Russian government had declined to pursue criminal charges against former Soviet security personnel, except in the most egregious cases. Routine executions for espionage didn't qualify, falling instead into the category of lawful acts under the legal framework that existed at the time. American intelligence officials who had recruited and run Mikhail as asset, Compass remained unnamed in declassified documents. Robert Mitchell, almost certainly a pseudonym, might still be alive somewhere, perhaps retired, perhaps still active in intelligence work. The operation designated Aerostat was one of thousands conducted during the Cold War, its human costs accepted as necessary within the calculus that governed espionage. From the American perspective, documented in CIA histories of the period, Compass had been a moderately successful source providing useful technical intelligence until his compromise. The loss was regrettable but not catastrophic. Operations continued, new sources were recruited, the broader mission proceeded without meaningful interruption. The machinery of intelligence work on both sides operated with moral frameworks that categorized human lives as acceptable losses, collateral damage, necessary sacrifices for strategic advantage. Individuals disappeared into these frameworks, their suffering abstracted into operational statistics. Dmitri's case was neither unique nor particularly notable in the broader context of Soviet repression. Thousands of families had been destroyed by similar mechanisms: arrests, executions, children left orphaned or stigmatized, entire networks of human connections severed by state violence. The specific details varied, but the essential pattern remained consistent. Totalitarian systems required this kind of destruction to function, creating conditions where trust became dangerous, where children could inadvertently condemn their parents, where following rules meant participating in atrocity. The philosophical questions had no satisfying answers. Can a 7-year-old be held accountable for words spoken without understanding their consequences? The legal answer was clear: no. The emotional reality for Dmitri was more complicated. Accountability might not apply, but causation remained undeniable. Where does blame reside in systems designed to corrupt ordinary human interactions and transform them into mechanisms of destruction? Individual actors made choices, but those choices occurred within structures that shaped available options, defined duties, and punished deviation. Vera Petrovna could have remained silent about Dmitri's words. KGB investigators could have dismissed the report as childish nonsense. Prosecutors could have recommended leniency. Judges could have imposed lesser sentences. American intelligence could have declined to recruit a Soviet engineer with a young family. At each decision point, different choices might have produced different outcomes, but the system was designed to channel decisions toward destruction, rewarding compliance and punishing mercy. Every April the 14th, the anniversary of the conversation he'd overheard, Dmitri traveled to prison cemetery number 3. The facility remained largely unmaintained despite occasional efforts by memorial organizations to preserve it. He stood at the location marked in prison records as plots 847R and 848R, the only grave visit possible when no markers existed. He brought no flowers, observed no religious rituals. He simply stood in the presence of absence, marking time's passage, acknowledging connection to two people he barely remembered. Memories of his parents had faded to fragments over 28 years. His mother's face existed in his mind as a composite of a few photographs and vague impressions. His father's voice had disappeared completely. What remained was not memory of living people, but awareness of permanent loss, of lives ended and relationships severed before they could fully form. His attempt to understand and forgive himself continued without resolution. Some days he managed to maintain intellectual distance, viewing his 7-year-old self as genuinely innocent, a child caught in circumstances beyond his capacity to navigate. Other days the guilt returned with crushing weight, the knowledge that his words had triggered everything erasing distinctions between intention and outcome. Therapy had helped marginally. A psychiatrist he'd seen irregularly between 2004 and 2008 had worked with him on cognitive approaches to managing guilt, on separating childhood innocence from adult responsibility. The work had been useful but incomplete. Some wounds don't heal. Some weights don't lighten regardless of how thoroughly they're examined. In 2010, Russia remained a country struggling with its relationship to Soviet history. Veterans of the Great Patriotic War were celebrated while victims of Stalin's terror received ambiguous acknowledgement. The KGB's successor agencies operated with renewed authority under a government that valued order over transparency. Public discourse about the Soviet period swung between condemnation and nostalgia, depending on political currents. Dmitry remained apart from these debates, uninterested in grand narratives about historical justice or national identity. His concern was more specific and more personal, understanding what had happened to his family, why it had happened, and how to continue living with knowledge that couldn't be changed or escaped. The broader lesson, if lessons could be extracted from such specific tragedy, related to systems that transform ordinary human actions into catastrophic consequences. A child speaking innocently, a teacher following protocol, parents making desperate choices under impossible pressure, officials processing cases according to established procedures, each action individually explicable, collectively producing horror. Totalitarian systems function through exactly this transformation, making mass atrocity possible not through exceptional evil but through ordinary compliance with structures designed to destroy. Dmitry understood this intellectually. It didn't reduce his guilt or restore his parents or repair the damage that cascaded through his life. He was 35 years old, living alone, working in isolation, visiting graves that existed only as coordinates in administrative records, carrying weight that would never fully lift. The truth he'd learned hadn't freed him. It had simply replaced incomplete understanding with complete knowledge of how thoroughly everything had been lost. Some stories don't resolve. Some wounds remain open. Some questions about responsibility and guilt resist definitive answers. History had moved forward. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Russia struggled towards something new. But for Dmitry, time remained frozen in April 1982, in the moment when childhood ended and everything changed, when innocently spoken words set in motion consequences that echoed across decades. He continued living because that's what people do. But the living was shadowed, burdened, shaped by absences that could never be filled, and guilt that could never be fully absolved. This was his inheritance. This was what remained when systems designed to corrupt and destroy had finished their work. July 28, 1982 arrived with grey skies and temperatures in the low teens Celsius. At Kresty Prison, a fortress-like detention facility on the Neva River's right bank, execution protocols followed established procedures refined over decades of Soviet penal practice. The condemned were moved from holding cells to a specialized section of the facility's basement level at approximately 5:30 a.m., their transfer coordinated to prevent contact between them. Mikhail Alexandrovich Sokolov was executed at 6 o'clock a.m. The method prescribed by Soviet law for Article 64 convictions was death by shooting, a single bullet to the back of the head, delivered at close range in a small concrete chamber designed for this specific purpose. 3 officials witnessed the execution as required by regulations: a prison administrator, a medical officer, and a representative from the procurator's office. The entire procedure, from entry to chamber to medical confirmation of death, lasted approximately 4 minutes. His body was removed and prepared for burial by prison staff trained in handling executed prisoners' remains. Irina Sergeyevna Sokolova was brought to the same chamber at 6:47 a.m. Records indicate she walked without assistance, declined the offer of sedation permitted under protocol, and spoke no final words when given the opportunity. The execution followed identical procedures. Death was certified at 6:51 a.m. Official death certificates were issued the same day, each bearing identical language, executed for crimes against the state in accordance with sentence handed down by the Leningrad Military District Court, June 17, 1982, under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. The certificates were filed in state archives but not provided to family members. Formal notification of death arrived 3 days later via registered mail containing no details about method, timing, or burial location. Both bodies were transported to Prison Cemetery No. 3, located approximately 7 kilometers northeast of Kresty in an industrial zone near the Okhta River. The facility served as the burial ground for executed prisoners and unclaimed deceased from correctional institutions across the Leningrad region. Graves were unmarked, identified only through coded coordinates maintained in prison administrative records. Mikhail was interred in Plot 847R. Irina occupied 848R, separated from her husband by approximately 2 meters of soil. No religious services were conducted. No family members were permitted attendance. Dmitry had been removed from Leningrad 11 days earlier. His maternal aunt, Galina Volkova, arrived from Petrozavodsk on July the 17th to assume guardianship, the transfer formalized through documents processed by local authorities with efficiency that suggested official pressure to resolve the matter quickly. The boy was told his belongings from the communal apartment had been packed, that he would be living with Aunt Galina now, that Leningrad was no longer his home. They departed by train July 19th, traveling northwest to Petrozavodsk, a city of approximately 250,000 people on the western shore of Lake Onega. The journey took 8 hours. Dmitry sat by the window watching landscape pass, asking questions that received careful, incomplete answers. "Where are Mama and Papa?" "They can't be with you right now." "When will I see them?" "I don't know, Dmitry." The official story provided to the child, as documented in later psychiatric evaluations, was deliberately vague. His parents had died in an accident. No specifics were offered about the nature of the accident, the date, or the circumstances. When Dmitry pressed for details, Galina deflected with variations of "it's too difficult to talk about" and "you're too young to understand." He was 8 years old by September 1982, enrolled in school number 28 in Petrozavodsk under his full legal name, Dmitry Mikhailovich Sokolov. The patronymic, identifying him as Mikhail's son, carried weight in a society where bureaucratic records were comprehensive and information traveled through official channels with systematic thoroughness. Teachers knew, school administrators knew, local KGB personnel monitoring the family of executed traitors knew. The social stigma manifested in subtle ways initially, then more overtly as Dmitry aged. In early years it appeared as careful distance maintained by other parents, their children permitted to play with him at school, but discouraged from forming close friendships. Birthday party invitations arrived infrequently. After-school activities that required parental supervision often had no space available when Galina inquired about enrollment. By age 12, Dmitry had begun to suspect the accident story was incomplete or false. Children are perceptive about gaps in adults' narratives, about the places where explanations fail to account for observed reality. His parents had died, but there were no graves he could visit. They had died in Leningrad, but no one would say where or how. Questions produced discomfort rather than answers. Galina, interviewed years later by researchers documenting the children of Stalin-era and post-Stalin political prisoners, described the burden of maintaining the deception. I wanted to tell him the truth, but what truth? That his parents were executed as traitors, that he had inadvertently contributed to their arrest. How do you explain such things to a child? KGB check-ins occurred with irregular frequency, sometimes quarterly, sometimes after longer intervals. An officer would arrive at Galina's apartment, request a private conversation with Dmitry, ask about his activities, his friends, his attitudes toward the Soviet state. The sessions rarely exceeded 20 minutes, but their occurrence reinforced his awareness that he remained under observation. His education continued through secondary school, his academic performance adequate but not exceptional. Teachers noted in evaluations that he was quiet, withdrawn, reluctant to participate in group activities or volunteer for leadership positions in the Komsomol youth organization. Applications to university programs were submitted in 1993 after the Soviet Union's collapse had theoretically eliminated the formal barriers that had previously restricted children of political criminals. Career prospects remained limited even in the new Russian Federation. The stigma of his parents' convictions persisted in official records, in the institutional memory of bureaucracies that had outlived the system they originally served. He found work eventually as a translator, a profession that required minimal social engagement and could be conducted with relative isolation. Psychological impact appeared in multiple forms across his adolescence and early adulthood. A psychiatric evaluation conducted in 1998 when he was 23 documented symptoms consistent with complex trauma. Difficulty forming emotional attachments, persistent guilt despite intellectual understanding that he bore no responsibility, recurring nightmares involving arrest and separation, hypervigilance in the presence of authority figures. The report noted, patient demonstrates classic presentation of survivor guilt compounded by the specific circumstances of his parents' arrest. He intellectually comprehends that as a 7-year-old child, he could not have understood the implications of his words. Emotionally, he struggles with belief that he caused their deaths. Galina did her best within the constraints of her own limited resources. She was 43 when she assumed guardianship, unmarried, working as a bookkeeper for a regional transportation bureau. Her 2-room apartment in Petrozavodsk became crowded with the addition of a child, but she never expressed resentment, at least not where Dmitry could hear it. She died in 2003 of a stroke. She was 64 years old. Dmitry had lost the last connection to his parents' world, the final person who had known them as living human beings rather than case file entries. He inherited her modest possessions and the weight of unanswered questions that had accumulated over 21 years of partial truths and strategic silences. The official notification of his parents' deaths, the letter that arrived in August 1982, stating they had been executed for crimes against the state, remained in Galina's papers, discovered after her death. She had kept it, hidden, never showing him. He read it for the first time at age 28. The words were bureaucratic, clinical, final. The Soviet Union was collapsing in stages throughout 1991, its 74-year existence unraveling through political upheaval, economic crisis, and the systematic dismantling of institutions that had seemed permanent. Dmitry Sokolov was 16 years old that year, finishing his final year of secondary school in Petrozavodsk, navigating adolescence while the world around him underwent revolutionary transformation. Glasnost, the policy of openness initiated under Gorbachev, had begun opening previously sealed archives, allowing access to records that documented decades of state repression. KGB files, trial transcripts, execution orders, the vast machinery of Soviet security apparatus was becoming available to families seeking information about disappeared relatives, executed prisoners, the millions consumed by totalitarian bureaucracy. Galina made her decision in March 1991. She had watched Dmitry grow from confused child to withdrawn teenager. had observed the toll of unanswered questions and incomplete narratives. He was 16 now, no longer a child. The truth, however devastating, seemed preferable to continued deception. They sat in her apartment on a grey afternoon, rain tapping against windows that overlooked a courtyard where snow still lingered in shaded corners. She told him everything, not gently, because there was no gentle way to deliver such information, but directly. His parents hadn't died in an accident. They had been arrested, tried and executed for espionage. They had been passing classified information to American intelligence. They had been convicted as traitors to the Soviet state. Dmitri's initial reaction was disbelief, complete rejection of what he was hearing. That's impossible. Papa was an engineer. Mama was a teacher. They weren't spies. I'm telling you what happened. I'm telling you what the state records say. You're lying. Why would you lie to me? But Galina's face carried no deception, only a weariness that came from carrying secrets too long. She showed him the official notification that had arrived in August 1982, the document she'd hidden for 9 years. The bureaucratic language was unambiguous, executed for crimes against the state under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. He read it 3 times. His hands shook. The comprehension arrived not as sudden illumination, but as gradual, crushing weight. Fragments of memory assembled into new configurations, the chaos in the apartment that night, his mother's bloodless face, the questions that had never received adequate answers, the social isolation he'd experienced throughout childhood, the careful distance maintained by adults who knew what he didn't. How? His voice barely audible. Galina explained what she knew from the fragments that had reached her through official channels and informal family networks. The espionage, the arrest, the trial, the execution. There's more, she said quietly. You were involved, though you didn't understand it. You said something at school, to your teacher, something you'd overheard. Dmitri felt the room tilt slightly. What did I say? I don't know the details, only that it led to their arrest. You were 7 years old. You couldn't have known. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. He didn't sleep that night or the next, his mind cycling through implications and guilt and the terrible mathematics of unintended consequences. A conversation overheard, words repeated innocently, a family destroyed. The journey to Moscow came in August 1991, during the failed coup attempt that would accelerate the Soviet Union's final dissolution. Dmitri traveled alone, carrying documentation of his relationship to Mikhail and Irina Sokolov, seeking access to the files that would reveal exactly what had happened. The KGB archives were in chaos, their gatekeepers uncertain about authority and access protocols during a period when the entire security apparatus was fragmenting. Dmitri's request was processed by a junior administrator who seemed more concerned with personal survival than maintaining institutional secrecy. Permission was granted after 3 days of bureaucratic navigation. Case file 7829L occupied 2 folders containing 247 pages of documentation. Dmitri read them in a small room under supervision, taking notes on paper provided by archive staff. The interrogation transcripts were clinical, detailed, devastating. His father's gradual confession, his mother's acknowledgement of complicity, the evidence photographs, the witness statements. Then he found his own testimony, recorded April 17, 1982, at school number 47. I heard Mama and Papa talking at night. Papa said he was meeting Robert on Saturday. I thought maybe they were planning something fun. The words appeared in neat, typed text preserved in official record, permanently documenting his role. He read the passage multiple times, each reading making it more rather than less incomprehensible. He had said this. 7-year-old Dmitri had spoken these words to an investigator, not understanding their significance, not knowing they would be used as evidence against the people he loved most. The investigator's notes appeared below his statement. Subject shows no awareness of significance of information. Responses consistent with innocent misunderstanding. Innocent. The word felt like condemnation rather than exoneration. Trial records revealed the rest: the conviction, the mandatory death sentence, the execution date, everything documented with bureaucratic precision, as though systematic record-keeping could legitimate what had occurred. He requested and received coordinates for his parents' burial location, plots 847R and 848R at Prison Cemetery No. 3 in Leningrad. The information came from prison administrative records that tracked every body interred in unmarked graves. Before returning to Petrozavodsk, Dmitri located Vera Petrovna Kuznetsova. She had retired from teaching in 1989, now living in a small apartment in Leningrad's Kalinin district. He found her address through school records that were remarkably easy to access during the administrative chaos of the collapsing Soviet state. She answered the door. A woman in her early 60s now, grey-haired, her face lined with age and something else. Recognition appeared immediately when he introduced himself. "Dmitri Sokolov. I knew you would come eventually." They spoke for 2 hours in her cramped living room. She didn't deny her actions or offer excuses. "I reported what you said because I believed it was my duty. I believed in the system. I thought I was protecting the state from enemies." "Do you still believe that?" Long silence. "No, I haven't believed it for years, but by the time I stopped believing, your parents were already dead." Her remorse was genuine but insufficient. What could remorse accomplish against irreversible consequences? She had followed protocols, fulfilled her responsibilities as pioneer coordinator and loyal Communist Party member, and in doing so had triggered a sequence of events that ended with 2 executions. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, as he prepared to leave. Dmitri looked at her, this elderly woman carrying her own burden of responsibility. "I don't know. I was 7 years old, you were the adult. But I said the words. I don't know where blame belongs anymore." He traveled to Leningrad in late August, finding Prison Cemetery No. 3 after consulting maps and making inquiries. The facility was abandoned in the post-Soviet chaos, unmaintained, overgrown with weeds. He located the section where plots 847R and 848R were positioned according to coordinates, standing in the space where his parents' bodies lay, buried 2 meters beneath his feet. No markers, no names, just earth and grass, and the knowledge that they were here. He stood for 40 minutes, not praying, he'd never learned how, but simply being present in the only place he could be with them. The guilt didn't resolve. Understanding that he'd been a child, that he'd had no capacity to comprehend the significance of his words, that the responsibility belonged to the system rather than to any individual. This intellectual knowledge provided no emotional relief. He returned to Petrozavodsk, carrying the weight of truth that was somehow heavier than the weight of not knowing had been. Galina watched him change in the months following. He became more withdrawn, more isolated, less able to engage with the ordinary demands of adolescent life. She suggested he speak with someone professionally, but mental health resources in early post-Soviet Russia were limited and stigmatized. "I killed them," he said one evening, the words emerging without preamble. "You were 7 years old." I still said the words. "The system killed them. The state killed them. You were a child." But the distinction felt meaningless to Dmitri. Cause and effect had clear lines. He had overheard. He had repeated. They had died, No amount of moral philosophy or contextual explanation could sever that chain of consequences.